In this Climategenn episode, I'm speaking with Mike Berners-Lee about his new book, Climate of Truth. Mike gives us his spiraling definition of the polycrisis that we are faced with today, and he cites examples of deceit in our society that have not just created the dire problems we face today, but are actually doubling down as we accelerate into the crosshairs of nightmare consequences. Despite the seriousness of the threats, Climate of Truth is a pragmatic book, helping to find ways to tap into personal agency, switching off malignant media, while calling out the lies and delusion that have gripped Western society. In the next episode, I will be speaking with esteemed legal expert Professor Dan Bodansky from Arizona State University about the second edition of the Art and Craft of International Environmental Law. We'll be discussing the complexities of how international environmental law has emerged, how it is effective, and whether it is even going to survive what some are calling the post-rules era, which sounds to me like an age of total chaos. Subscribers help to keep the interview series going, and we have many more episodes in the pipeline in this period of environmental, socio-political flux. Thank you to all who subscribe. Please do send feedback or add comments. I do try to read and respond. You can also order my book Cop Out, that is available worldwide from many online retailers. Thank you. Mike, it's very good to see you to discuss your new book, Climate of Truth. It's not a typical climate book. Where did the inspiration come from to write Climate of Truth?
I've been working on this climate stuff for, 20 years or something now. And it's not really a book just about climate. I think that's worth saying that at the start. But if you look at climate, reality is that we're not getting anywhere on it. If you look at the carbon curve, the greenhouse gas emissions per year, or emissions from fossil fuel, what you find is that every year they're higher than they were the year before. In other words, we're making the climate worse by a larger amount every year than we made it worse the year before. And that's despite 29 of these climate COPs, these huge international conferences to try and deal with the crystal clear science that climate change is a big deal and we need to do something about it. So what we're doing is absolutely not working. So what do you do in a situation where your approach to solve a problem has consistently not been working for 30 years now? And just to be clear, some people say, oh, we're making progress, but not fast enough. The core facts are against them, right? We are accelerating into the problem. So what do you do in a situation like that? Well, you don't just keep trying the same tactics harder and harder and hope that they'll suddenly start working. It's important to stand back, take stock, stand further back from the problem, see if a greater distance will provide some insights. And also, it's important to get under the skin of the problem, see if we can understand more deeply the reasons behind the reasons behind the reasons why what we're doing is not working. And that's the exercise that I went through. And it took me to a climate of truth in my search for, if nothing so far has been working, what could we find that might, for the first time, change the whole dial and enable effective action for the first time?
We'll get into that a little bit. I just want to touch on one word that comes up a lot in the book, and that's polycrisis. Can you give us your sort of elevator summary of the polycrisis?
Well, we talk a lot about a climate crisis, but if you really look at what it would take to solve the climate crisis, you have to see it as one symptom of something much bigger that's going on for humanity, and there are other symptoms as well. So what's going on for humanity is that we've suddenly become a very, very powerful species, much more powerful than the resilience of our planet to put itself back together again after we've exerted our influence on it. And to illustrate that, if you look at our energy supply, the amount of energy that we use every year as a species is going up and up and up, rising pretty steeply, 2.4% per year growth average rate. And alongside that increasing energy, we have rising technology, which means we can do more with every megawatt hour of energy. And we exert that influence on our planet with a mixture of accident and design. And when we were a less powerful species, it didn't matter because the planet could put put itself back together again. But now it can't. Some people call it the Anthropocene. We've had a few decades of being in this Anthropocene and being able to get away with living as if we're not in it, using the same economics framework, the same basic approach to politics, the same ways of doing life, the same ways of running on, thinking about our businesses and all of this. But what is critical about right now is we're at the point at which our failure to adapt to this brand new context for humanity to be in is taking us into an escalating crisis. And I call it a polycrisis because there's a climate dimension, but just as serious as that, there is a nature dimension to it. We are hemorrhaging our biodiversity, and that feels like an abstract thing. It's not just about pretty birds in the trees. It really affects the capacity for humans to thrive. And related to all of that, we've got a pollution crisis, not least through our plastics. The growth rate on plastics is much, much steeper than it's ever been on fossil fuel. And practically all the plastic in the world has been produced in my lifetime. And we are finding out now that it is disrupting our endocrine system. So it's messing up our hormones. It's affecting our fertility. It's giving us certain types of cancers. And it's not just our species it's affecting other species as well. And it's permanent. And so plastic is a very good illustration of our kind of blundering arrival in this Anthropocene. We tend to invent things, we find they're useful, we have a market economy, anything that's useful gets used because it gives you an advantage. Then everyone's got to use it, otherwise they get left behind. And the next thing you know, we're addicted to this stuff, whether or not it's in the best interests of people and planet. So other elements of the polycrisis, population growth, which I've got some quite good news about in the book, actually. It's not quite as bad as some people think it is. And we've got some rising disease threats. Some of those are coming out of the way that we're running our food system. And food insecurity is an emerging thing as well. So that's what I mean by a polycrisis at the kind of physical level. And then that's what I describe in the book as the outer layer of the polycrisis, the physical symptoms. And the great news is that they're, broadly speaking, technically solvable. We can talk about the technical solutions to climate, but they're basically there for us to take. So the question becomes, why aren't we solving these technically solvable challenges? And that takes you into, to unpeel the outer layer of the polycrisis and see what's underneath it. And you find that it's not just a polycrisis, it's like a metacrisis. In other words, it's going on at a deeper level. It's unsurprising that an economics framework basically put together pre-Anthropocene turns out not to be fit for purpose in the Anthropocene. The same with our approach to politics that dates back to a time when the complexity of the decisions that we had to make was entirely different. Things weren't so systemic and joined up and complex and global as they are now. And that demands a different approach that we haven't yet managed to adopt. And similarly, there are some things about our legal system and a whole load of other things about how we do life that needs unpicking.
It certainly is a polycrisis. There's a snowball there. Well, let's unpick some of that. You mentioned the COPs, which are a political climate summit, global every year. I've been to the last 10, and it's very difficult to go to these things and see any road that's constructive coming out of it. That breeds a strange inertia in national politics. How do you view politics at our national level now? Because it seems to be squashed between messages from the US or from Europe or from internally our own squabbles. What's the view for you there with policymakers?
The science is crystal clear about what needs to happen. And we're absolutely not getting there. And the UK has, in some ways, it's taken some good steps, not necessarily totally in line really with what the science says needs to be happening. But, maybe if every country had pushed as hard as we've been pushing, then maybe we'd be making more progress. But in many ways, we haven't been consistently calling out the situation on the terms that it needs to be called out. So we come away from a COP that's a failure, but has managed to construct a narrative around itself to make it look as if it's not really a failure and some good things came out of it and maybe it was a sort of muted success or something, and it wasn't. And that's actually really unhelpful. The worst thing that can come out of a COP is for it not to get anywhere and for everybody to say that it did. right? Because that's just complacent. And in a way, the best thing that came out of COP29 was a more widespread acknowledgement that this whole process is broken. And actually, it has been broken since year dot. It's been cynically undermined by vested fossil fuel interests with a great deal of skill. And to summarize, they will basically allow the policymakers to say and do anything they like, as long as it won't succeed in reducing the rate at which fossil fuel is ripped out of the ground at the global level and burned, which of course is the one thing that we need to stop happening.
If you take that outcome of the COPs, which has pretty much been internalized by people who are following this stuff, at a national level, the way that we digest our media, civil society is very, very divided, very polarized. And the fact that you've got climate in the title of the book would be a turnoff for some people. They're like, oh, I can't read that. That conflicts with my worldview. So can we as individuals bridge this gap, repair what's been broken over the last, let's say, 20 years of social media at least?
The audience that I have in mind are people who care about environmental and social issues. Doesn't need to be climate. Doesn't matter whether it's climate you care about the most. Are tearing their hair out over the inability to sort things out. So it could be inequality. Here we are with escalating rates of inequality around the world and in the UK and so on. And it's as clear as daylight, I think, that you can't deal with climate until you've sorted that out. And, we see things going, wrong within countries and between countries and so on. And you kind of think, look, we could be making so much better decisions than this. We could be handling this stuff, and we're not. And if you're tearing your hair out thinking, well, nothing's working, and it's tempted to get a bit depressed about it. Well, my book is all about saying, you know what? There is a point of leverage that will give you more agency than you may have thought you had. Because the show-stopping thing that is stopping us getting anywhere with all of this stuff is deceit, right? So it turns out, if you look at the worst decisions on climate, the failure of the COPs, bogus debates in this country about whether to have new coal mines and things like that. They don't have poor judgment at their heart. They have flat out deceit. And the same goes with many other elements of the polycrisis. If you look at plastics, there are bogus narratives being put out by the plastics industry that all we've got to do is recycle a bit more, and that's just never, ever going to cut it. And same with the meat industry is rolling its sleeves up on things, and there are bogus narratives around inequality as well. The idea of trickle down, that the best way of improving the lives of the poorest is to make the rich richer, so a bit of it will trickle down. All those narratives, they haven't got poor judgment at their root. They've got dishonesty. And if we can raise the standard on that, if we can dramatically raise the standard of honesty in our politics, media, and business, those are the three domains that I focus on, then that enables, for the first time, the possibility of the quality of decision-making that we actually need.
So it takes courage to call it out, and it also takes the ability to spot it. And I think, how does that agency manifest? What's the sort of tripwire for it, if you like?
First of all, we've got to recognize that it matters, right? We've got to spot that it's so disabling. And this is so obvious. I mean, duh. If a politician is actually deliberately trying to make you believe something that they don't personally believe is true, then, that's just a nonsense, isn't it? It tells you straight up that person can't be on your side. And what on earth are you doing wanting them in the decision-making mix? And, and if they've misled you on one thing, it tells you that they don't really care about being truthful with you. So it tells you can't trust them on anything at all. And it also tells you can't trust any of their colleagues who've stood by if they knew that they were being dishonest.
In the book, you talk about psychopaths. And this is really pertinent in the world that we are in right now. Can you talk about what made you zoom in on that?
Okay, so let's just stick with politics for a second and just say, look, we need the right people in the decision-making mix. We actually need two things from them. We need them to be honest, and we need them to care about the people that they are playing a part in governing, right? Taking decisions on behalf of. So we need them to have empathy. We need them to have, we actually need them to have global empathy because these problems are global. And the point about a psychopath is it's a person that doesn't have empathy, right? And we've been allowing people who are dishonest and don't care about us. They care about themselves and not about us, the people. We've been allowing them into incredibly powerful positions. We've been allowing them to be prime ministers and presidents and also to run media empires and also to run, other huge businesses and so on. And it's just so destructive for us. One way of framing up the whole challenge is to say we've got to get ourselves out of the grip of the psychopaths. There's 1 or 2% of the population that needs containing, because they can't contain themselves. They don't feel shame and guilt when they do things that are bad for other people. They are narcissistic and lack empathy. And if there's only 1 or 2% of them in the population, we can, as long as we collaborate on this, the rest of us, we can contain them. We can stop them getting very damaging. But if we don't come together to contain them, then we can get badly outmaneuvered by them. The smart ones can be very, very skillful and manipulative, and they can trick us into doing things like electing them to be prime minister or president or whatever. And the consequences will come back to bite us. So, one of the ways of doing that is to hang on to this concept of honesty, ask really careful about questions about who do we trust. And if we find out that we can't trust somebody, just do what we can to get them out of our politics. And the same goes for our media, and the same goes for the businesses that we buy from.
If you step back today, the horse is kind of bolted in that sense because we're surrounded by these psychopaths, and you hear people saying, it's the end of the rules-based era, which is quite a awful thing to say because that implies we're in real chaos. And you're still saying that acting collectively, collaborating is the one way that we can wrest back some form of a sane world.
I mean, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know for sure what's possible, but it doesn't feel to me at all proven that we can't get things back again a long way. But we've been lazy on truth, right? We've been really lazy on truth. There's been like a post-truth experiment. In the book, I'm pretty explicit in some of the examples. The book's not about calling out individuals as much as to illustrate a point. But a major political party allowed somebody who had been sacked for dishonesty to stand as a parliamentary candidate. He got into parliament. That whole party membership voted him in to be party leader. We, the electorate, voted that person to be prime minister, despite an absolute catalogue of deceit. And this is absolutely emphatically not a party political book. But by the time the Conservative Parliament got to the last election, it was just routinely being dishonest on a daily basis, right? Because we'd been careless about it, right? The media was being careless about it. The BBC wasn't calling people out properly. So Rishi Sunak could say things like, Labour is funded by Just Stop Oil, complete load of nonsense, and he just didn't pay a price for it. But we, the public, were lazy about this stuff. We've been buying media that we know is owned by a multi-billionaire with a track record of swinging elections and doing things that are knowingly deceitful in order to swing those elections. Well, do we want to be taken for a ride? Because if you don't want to be taken for a ride, we've got to steer clear of media like that. And if you don't want to be taken for a ride in politics, then you've got to push for higher standards of integrity in politics, which admittedly sometimes means you have to vote for the least unfit, which, just to make the point, it is really important in a situation like that to vote for the least unfit, because by doing so, we really do raise the standards. But I mean, it's not just at election time that we can influence our politics.
You've mentioned the media, and you've mentioned that we as civil society have been collectively lazy.
Yeah.
But we're moving into this era of tipping points, thresholds, baked in consequences. And this is what a corrupted cop system has given us. It seems like it's a critical moment now for us to find a way to influence that longer trajectory of policy making. But how do you envisage that we get round something like 80% of the UK media is owned by billionaires or is sort of maligned? How do we wrest that honesty back into the overall discourse that we're having amongst ourselves?
I'm not going to say it's easy. And I'm not going to sugarcoat this. We've been so dopey on the case for so long now that we've let things get pretty serious. And maybe in a bit we'll speculate on how serious things are and, have we left it too late and what do we know about that? But in terms of what we can do, we can have a culture in which we ask critical questions about what tells us that we can trust this media. And we switch. If we're not happy with what we're getting, we switch. And not only that, but we challenge our friends, our family members, and our colleagues who are using traditional or social media that can't be trusted for whatever reason, supposing it's owned by somebody who has a nefarious track record. Then just get out. Switch to something else. If you're on X, just to give an example, switch to Blue Sky. Do it now, right? Don't put any money into bad media and don't fund its advertising. Don't support its advertising streams by viewing it either. Switch over, and then if you possibly can, pay money to the good media that you're trying to support, because it costs money to produce good media, and create an amplifying effect by demand the same standards from your friends, family, and colleagues. Ask them, if they're reading a paper that's owned by a nefarious multi-billionaire, ask them, don't they care? Do they want to be abused? Are their critical thinking skills not strong enough that they ask these kinds of questions? Let's make it socially embarrassing to be seen to be one of those suckers who just doesn't mind being manipulated. And I'm not saying it's going to be easy to change the dial on this, but I think there are increasingly more and more people who are yearning for what can we trust. They're yearning for this higher standards of integrity in public life. And social tipping points like this can happen very quickly. And I think the timing is right for it in the UK now, because we've had a post-truth experiment and some of the results of that are starting to come into roost. For example, whatever the rights and wrongs of Brexit, it was missold to the British public. And there are lots of people now who see that they were missold Brexit, and it might have sounded fun at the time, but it's not fun when you lose your job, and it's not fun when your health service that you were promised 300 million an extra a week for turns out to be collapsing, and all these things, there's a case for being a bit cross about that. So I think we're ready to row back from that post-truth experiment, and we absolutely must. And actually where we need to get to is a higher standard of integrity than we've perhaps ever needed before, because the nature of the challenge absolutely demands it. It's like an evolution of humanity. We need to get to the point where we value the clearest view of reality incredibly highly, because without the clearest view we can get, we just can't make the quality of decisions that we need in order to get through the situation that we're in.
Based on what you've just said, people like Johan Rockström, they talk about this operating space for humanity and the impacts that we're seeing now on a regular basis, which are just off the charts crazy. A lot of people leave comments, and in private conversations, there's a lot of this sort of, it's too late, we're finished, it's all hell from here on in. How do you see it from your perspective?
Well, I think when we're talking about this stuff, I think it's really important not to exaggerate anything for dramatic effects. I think that's really unhelpful. And it's really important not to sugarcoat things in order to kind of make the message more acceptable. I think that's really unhelpful. I think it's important to try and put across a kind of, I'll try and portray the most realistic view of reality as I see it as possible. And in the book, I refer to the Kubler-Ross grief transition curve that was developed originally by a psychologist who was trying to understand the human reaction to people discovering they were terminally ill. But it can be used to describe the human reaction to any piece of uncomfortable news, right? And the situation we're in at the moment, it's uncomfortable. We tend to deny that when we first hear about it, and then we get angry about it, and then we tend to try and bargain with the problem and get it agreed to be less serious than it really is, and then maybe we get all depressed about it when we see how bad it really is. And then if we can come through all that, we might get to the point of accepting the problem and being able to roll our sleeves up and for the first time actually take action in a way that is meaningful and helpful and makes the best of the situation. And that's where we need to get to right now. So with all of that in mind, where are we now? Well, we've been very, very dopey on the subject for a long, long time. We've been getting nowhere. We're accelerating into the problem. We've been allowing deceitful activities to corrupt all our attempts to get somewhere. And the science, meanwhile, has been getting more and more serious. on this. I mean, we're starting to see some symptoms of climate change coming through. And even if we take very strong action to cut greenhouse gases at a very rapid rate now, those symptoms are going to get significantly worse. The scientific community is only just really rolling its sleeves up on this notion of cascading tipping points and trying to understand better at what point might the symptoms of climate change reinforce climate change to the point that it all spirals out of control no matter what we do about it. And we don't know. So we don't know the extent to which methane exploding out of melting permafrost creates more climate change, which creates more forest fires, which creates more melting ice, and all those things also exacerbate climate change. And when does it all go wild? But we do know that we're absolutely throwing the dice. So there was a paper came out just to illustrate this in the summer last year, the State of the Climate Report 2024 by some of the world's top scientists, Johan Rostrom, Michael Mann, Tim Lenton, and loads of others. And the final sentence in that report is, the future of humanity hangs in the balance, because we are absolutely throwing the dice. And just for context, that's as close as you get to screaming in peer-reviewed academic scientific literature, right? Johan Rostrom can't articulate any more loudly and clearly how much trouble we're heading for. And the answer is, can we get out of this? I don't know. The other thing that we really don't know is just how stable is the comparatively peaceful and stable global order that I've known for all my lifetime. So there have always been the odd hotspots and so on, but we haven't had a world war in my lifetime. But I think we're seeing evidence that wars can break out very rapidly. Global understandings and treaties and arrangements that we all thought we could rely on don't turn out to be as reliable as all that. We don't know how resilient the global order is to proper food security scares or proper migration pressures, which we're only seeing the beginnings of at the moment, but they are kind of growing. So the answer is we don't know, but we know we're really throwing the dice, like properly throwing the dice. Anyone listening to this podcast, I would say you can carry on ignoring climate, for example, if you like, but if you're going to do that, don't count on another couple of decades of the kind of security that you may have known all your lifetime. I wouldn't even count on one more decade of it. I mean, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. But if we carry on in broadly the vein that we're carrying on now, it wouldn't surprise me at all if we had a really incredibly uncomfortable situation within the next decade.
In an attempt to, I agree with you, and I would say in an attempt to put a slightly positive edge on this. Is there a sort of a counterintuitive thing? You said earlier, that from the year dot, the cops have had the failure baked into them. And in this period of accelerating impacts, era of consequences, the masks have really come off the things like the cop now, and in a lot of politics, we can see who everyone is and what their real agendas are. And part of that is a kind of wakening up where it's all pouring out now, the truth. And we've got to try and know what's what and respond. And that's a messy process. It has to be messy by definition.
I talked through that Kubler-Ross brief transition curve, right? And if you look at humanity now, and if you look at the UK population as well, what you see is that we're strung out across the length of that curve. We're all in different places, bobbing around at different times. Some of us are kind of accepting things, but then you've got to ask the question, at what level of depth are we accepting it, right? So we get the climate as a problem, but do we understand the depth of solution that is required? Do we understand that the economic framework actually has to get challenged in some ways? This idea of pursuing GDP growth as the central metric, it's just bogus, right? It's just absolutely not going to help us deal with it. So there's a lot of denial at the level that goes under the surface. So what I'd say to all policymakers is you've really got to come to terms with that and help each other to come to terms with that and join up the issues much, much more. But I want to say, by way of encouragement, about a little anecdote that I've been doing now. So I give lots of talks to business audiences, and I've been laying out this polycrisis in terms that are about as serious as I've laid out to you. I'm fleshed out a bit more detail, which possibly makes it even a bit more serious than I've laid out to you. And then I just ask for a show of hands. And sometimes I'm doing an online talk, and we do a secret ballot. And I just ask people to raise their hand if they think I've got it broadly right. It's about as serious as I've said, or to raise their hand if they think I've fundamentally exaggerated how serious the situation is, or if they think I've fundamentally under-egged how serious it is. And every single time, I've done this for thousands of people. I've probably done it for 10,000 people now, across 30 or 40 talks or something like that. I don't know. And every single one of those times, I get the same response. The vast majority of people put up their hand and said, yeah, they agree. It's as serious as this. And there's always a few who say I've under-egged it. And there's usually one who says they think I've exaggerated it. And when I ask them afterwards about it, they say, oh, well, I speak, English isn't my first language. I misunderstood the question or something like that, usually, right? Yeah. So everybody gets it, right? We're all sitting here and we get it. And yet, all the cultural clues we're getting are telling us to carry on as before, right? So we turn on the radio in the morning, maybe we turn on Radio 4, you hear all about this business as usual issue, that business as usual issue, and you might get a mention of climate and nature maybe occasionally, but the underlying flavor is business as usual, business as usual. And we're stuck in this. Here we are, we all get it individually. We don't often understand how much all the people around us get it. Very few people are prepared to be the first mover on this. It reminds me of COVID, right? If you are ever the only person in a room wearing a mask or the only person in a room not wearing a mask, whatever the rights and wrongs of it, it's really uncomfortable to be the odd one out, right? So everyone's just looking at everybody else, asking who's going to move on this. Because it needs some disruptive thinking and it needs some bravery. It needs to take some real courage now. And so this is what my plea to everyone on the podcast is: call it out. If you get it, then people around you probably deep down get it as well. And if you're in a meeting that's not acting in a way that is commensurate with this being the context that we're in, then challenge it. Because it's not a question of, I'll think about it for a year and maybe I'll do it next year. This is your opportunity. And if you don't want to be on your deathbed, knowing that you sat here like a pudding when the opportunity to do something was here, then the time to start calling things out is now. And it gives me no glee to say this is going to take some courage and it's going to be uncomfortable. But that is where we have to do it now. And just take heart from the fact that the people around you, by and large, are actually going to be feeling, at least at some level, thank God that person's saying it. That's what I think too.
Mike, I have one more question, and it's really to do with how we internalize where we're going. Because at the moment, we're imbibing crap all the time from social media. So I saw someone call all these video shorts crackbait the other day, and it seemed like a very good description. But ultimately, it's a future that is dystopian. It's not very attractive. How do we not think in terms of charts, but think in terms of futures we can believe in? Is there something that you can add on that?
I mean, in some ways, what's so frustrating about this whole challenge is that there's nothing not to like about the transition that we should be pushing for. But we don't talk enough about this positive vision. So a world in which we're less addicted to needless stuff, and in which we're growing our food more thoughtfully and more healthily, and in which the air is cleaner, and in which we are living in better houses that require less energy and all this kind of stuff, and where our communities are stronger and there's less inequality, and, we all have just better psychological health and so on. All this is there to be played for, but we don't talk up that narrative anything like enough. And we're getting bombarded by a very unhealthy kind of advertising narrative that tells us if we don't have this stuff and that stuff, we've got to be uncomfortable with ourselves and we've got to be dissatisfied in something. And it's all a complete load of nonsense. And it's only propped up by very well-funded advertising campaigns that are not in our best interest. So we need to work up the positive narrative of what this transition will be like. But I don't want to sugarcoat this because we have left this very, very late. So I'm not sure if those better futures will be realizable or not. But however late we've left it, the faster we can start making this transition, the better world we'll have for ourselves and the higher our quality of life will be. I still think that with a following wind and a good dose of luck, we might really create a better future than we've had so far. But we do now need that dose of luck to go on top. And the final thing I want to say about this transition is that I think we will feel psychologically much more healthy when we start doing the right thing. At the moment, it weighs us down. We know that the evidence is saying we are hurtling into a terrible crisis, and yet we are carrying on as usual. And that is uncomfortable. We know deep down we're not living the way we should be living. And if we change that and start living the way and start making the changes we need, start living the way we need to believe, I think we'll feel brilliant. Right? We will just know we're doing the right thing, and it'll be a weight off our shoulders. And in one sense, almost no matter how bad things get, we will feel great about it.
Well, look, Mike, I think this is probably a good place to round off. We don't want to be sitting there like puddings. Thank you very much. I enjoyed reading the book. It's a different table. It's not a climate book. It's a sort of a nuts and bolts of action book.
It sounds like a climate book. It's not. It doesn't matter what you care about. Whatever it is you care about most, your point of greatest leverage is to push for higher standards of honesty in politics, media, and business.
Oh, thank you very much. It's been great to speak to you.
Thank you.
If you are concerned about the future, then why not travel with me through every COP conference from COP21 in Paris to COP28 in Dubai by ordering my book COP Out: How Governments Have Failed the People on Climate. In COP Out, you'll gain insights into what is actually going on in these supposed world-saving conferences and how we have ended up in this dire era of dangerous consequences. You can order COP Out via the link in the notes or on any online bookstore worldwide in paperback or audio version.